días. Bueno, para los que no me conocéis, soy Juan Vázquez, pertenezco a la Junta Directiva de REDU y provengo de la Universidad de Sevilla. A mí me toca hacer la presentación de Gwen van de Velden, y bueno, pues esta mañana mirando un poco cómo iba a presentarla, al final llega uno a la conclusión de que traducir determinados términos en inglés al castellano es bastante más difícil que presentarla directamente en inglés, porque la verdad es que quizás ahí tenemos un camino también que recorrer, como decía Amparo, ¿no? Y es un poco encontrar el vocabulario adecuado a veces para una terminología inglesa que la verdad es que suele definir bastante más concretamente, bajo mi punto de vista, y con una mayor precisión determinados conceptos que a nosotros nos cuesta casi 2 o 3 líneas, ¿no? Y ellos casi lo hacen con una palabra. Así que intentaré que mi inglés sea el mejor posible para que el pobre traductor me traduzca adecuadamente. Gwen van de Velden is Director of Learning and Teaching Enhancement at the University of Bath. A university which is consistently in the top 10 of every national ranking of teaching excellence. She is support to the provides Chancellor Learning and Teaching on developing and implementing the university education strategy and objectives. Gwen has more than 20 years experience in higher education. She has worked at Radboud University in Netherlands until 1995, University of Kent until 2006, and the University of Bath since then, leading teams of academic staff, developers, student learning, advisors, quality officers, e-learning developers, and teaching innovators. Gwen holds various national roles, including membership of the HAFCA steering group for the review of the National Student Survey and information provision for students. The HAFCA News Initiative Steering Group for the Student Engagement Partnership Unit, Planning Executive of the Standing Conference for Academic Practice, Planning Group member and former chair of the Heads of Educational Development Group since 2005, former chair of the Learning, Teaching and Quality Network of the 1994 Group since 2010, Journal Steering Group since 2011, QAA Advisory Group on the Student Engagement from 2012. So, Gwen is also international active, especially with India through the British Council, including visits, workshops, and presentation on e-learning, quality management, and organizational change. She has led a successful British Council bid in 2012 for longer-term establishment of e-learning, networking, and partnership. Como podéis, espero haber entendido, su trayectoria es ingente, es decir, el número de organizaciones y de grupos que lidera o a los que pertenece y en los que tiene gran parte o gran actividad es realmente increíble y, por tanto, seguro que su visión de el tema que hoy nos concierne aquí, seguro que nos abrirá, como decía Amparo, nuevas puertas, nuevos caminos de algo que, aunque muy incipiente en las universidades españolas, en mi opinión, y por eso REDU ha intentado abordar este tema, creemos que debe ser un tema de debate y un tema a modificar. Es decir, nos parece importante que la presencia del estudiante en las universidades no sea solo una presencia puntual para escuchar a un profesor, sino que sea algo mucho más holístico, mucho más amplio, donde haya otros muchos aspectos que permitan el proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje. Pues nada más, les dejo con Gwen y seguro que disfrutaremos de su conferencia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. When I hear these things, I always wonder, who are they talking about? It doesn't sound like me, but thanks anyway. Thank you for all the organizers for making me feel so welcome here. It's been really special already, and we haven't even started the conference fully. People have been very kind, and thank you also for the translators who make it possible that whatever I say comes across, so thank you. I'd like to tell you a bit about the journey that my university has gone through over the last few years. Now, what's happened to us very much fits within the British national policy for higher education. And from some conversations yesterday, I understand how different it is. So I will interrupt myself every now and then to explain why we do things because of our national policy and regulation. Higher education in the UK has undergone a lot of change in the last 15 to 20 years. Now, we always say we've undergone a lot of change, but this really is quite considerable. We used to have two parts to the sector. We used to have the public sector, and we used to have the polytechnic universities. Since 1992, we don't have that separation anymore. So our polytechnics and our old universities are all in one group. This explains why we have 140 institutions in England alone. It is about 170 if you include Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. We have devolution, so the higher education system in Scotland is different than it is in England. In Scotland, students do not pay fees. In England, they pay £9,000 fees per year. That is a loan, you don't pay it up front, but it does mean that the students know that when they come out of their 3-year degree, if they keep it to 3 years, if it's 4, it's more, it's 5, it's even more. If they stayed with the 3-year degrees, they have got a debt of £27,000. I have 4 children. My husband and I have decided not to calculate how much 4 times £27,000 is, because I think we're going to have to sell the house. What happens is that when students graduate and they earn over £21,000 a year, they start paying back their fees. So it automatically comes out of their salary, so it sits alongside the tax. To some extent, that's the only way you can do it. If you actually had the kind of loans in the way it was done in the United States, it simply wouldn't be possible in the UK. That's made quite a considerable change to how we think about universities. And what we were very worried about, this is the 3rd year that these fees are in, what we were very worried about is that students would come in and say, if I pay £9,000, you are responsible for making sure that I get a good degree, because that's the deal. We were worried about consumerism. And there are parts of the sector where that kind of consumerism does take place. We are fortunate at the University of Bath, I'll tell you a bit more about that, that means that we don't have those kind of problems. There is an upside to it as well. With making a commitment to at least £27,000 to pay back for your higher education, students are now saying that they will get the best out of it. So they engage. They have higher expectations, but they also have higher expectations on themselves. So what we're noticing is that where in the past it used to be quite difficult to set students a lot of reading and to get on with things in their own time and then come back at the next lecture and expect them to have read the book, they do it now, because that's part of, they want to make their investment worthwhile. So there's some interesting changes that we didn't quite expect. We were mostly worried that the higher education sector would become a product in the way a theme park is, or you buy a holiday, that sort of thing. And that's not really what happened. In that context, about 10 years ago, the higher education sector in the UK felt strongly, and that was before the fees and before we knew that the fees were coming in, because nobody thought of it at that point. We introduced what we call the National Student Survey. This means that all final year students, whether that's their 3rd year, their 4th year, their 5th year, but in their final year, between February and end of April, get sent a survey, which asks them 22 questions about their institution. It ranges from the quality of the teaching, to the quality of the library, to whether the timetable worked for them, to whether the teaching was interesting, whether assessment was well organized, whether marking was fair, whether feedback was received, and part of the questions also are about how the institution engaged with them. And this was a debate that we had not had in the UK. There were universities that were looking at those sorts of things, but it certainly wasn't the case that across the board, suddenly, the student voice mattered. So that was a huge change for us to deal with. Some universities found this very, very difficult indeed, and some universities engaged with it quite early on. So some of our very, very, very old universities, and you can fill in the blanks yourself, have always had the view that if you manage to get into Oxford or Cambridge, you are lucky to get into Oxford or Cambridge, and it's your problem, you need to get on with it. And this is changing the debate, because suddenly those students have a voice. They say what's going well, and as an institution, you know if it's not going well. And that's been a real change for us, because we did not necessarily engage with that before. Some universities did, and some didn't. For other universities, it's been a real shock, because there are differences in terms of how disciplines respond. If you have a lot of arts, and if you have a lot of computer science, your scores are going to be lower, because for some reason, computer science students and art students are more critical than anybody else, and they'll give you lower scores. If you have a school of management, business, law, they always score you higher. We don't really know why. This is something to do with the nature of the discipline, but it has an influence. And at that point, as an institution, you're in a funny situation where your discipline mix rather matters. Now, the NSS has been around for, it's not 10, it's 11 years now, and that has led to our national newspapers making league tables. So there is a lot of ranking in Britain. Once a year, the major 4 newspapers make a league table to show which university does best. That means that parents and prospective students, when they make their choices about which university they go to, the newspaper is always there, and those rankings come out around about the time that students have to make that choice and fill in their application forms. So the ranking has become a huge influence on higher education. So from 15 years ago, where we had a separate sector and the public institutions delivered a good education, and it worked for society, but it was a public good, and people paid a low fee for it, we now have a situation which is highly marketized. There are rankings, we talk about a product. It's quite interesting, I was saying this yesterday, sometimes when I meet with a group of vice-chancellors, the discussion is about what the student market is like, what market share they have within the student sector, what the loan fees are going to do, what the financial indicators are. It is a completely different conversation than it used to be. Whether we like it or not, in Britain, it's there, and we have to deal with it. And we have to look at how we continue to work with students in a way that concentrates on the transformational side, the learning, the process that students go through coming in at, say, 18 until they're 21, 22, 23, and they come out, and the process that they've gone through intellectually, personally, psychologically, in terms of their skills and in terms of their willingness to take responsibility and make a contribution to society. That's what we want to concentrate on, because that's what academic institutions are for. At the same time, we now have to look at the transactional. So we have to look at, for their £9,000, is the library open often enough? Are there enough books? Is the lecture theatre up to scratch, or does it look a bit awful, really? Is the teaching done appropriately in a way that students find engaging and satisfying? So there's a whole new strand of discussion has come through. And for people like me, educational developers, essentially, that is a different discussion than we've ever had before. We've always concentrated on the pedagogical, which is on the transformational side. We are now being asked by our institutions to also look at the transactional side. I thought I'd just paint you that picture to give you a bit of an idea of the background to the British higher education and the kind of challenges that we're dealing with. Has the translation caught up? I can still hear. Yeah, I'll be there. Okay, right. Let's get started. The BAS student experience. We are in amongst 120 to 140 other institutions. You need to be something specific. You need to be distinctive. We are 17,000 students, we are research intensive, and we are campus based. We have a lovely campus on top of the hill, wonderful trees, some really ugly 1960s architecture, lots of concrete and asbestos. But it's a very nice campus. All our first year students live on campus. So we have large residential halls. This is quite deliberate because we want them to become part of the academic community. So it is part of the student experience that they live in the university. Their social life is in the university, their sports life is in the university, their cultural life is within the university. All of that takes place. I'm not British myself, I am Dutch. In the Netherlands, there's only one university that does that. So this was quite an experience for me to see what a difference that makes in terms of how the students engage with their institution. And they really are part of a village. Of course, in the second and the third year, they've grown up a bit and they really don't want to be in that village anymore, so they live in town in shared accommodation or whatever, and they sort themselves out. But that first year is very important in terms of setting the tone. We have a strong science and engineering background, lots of social science. Our management school is second in the country at the moment, which, considering Oxford and Cambridge both have a business school, of course, is quite good. We have a small humanities portfolio, so we don't have the arts problem, as it's now known in the UK. We don't have fine arts or anything like that. We only have modern languages. That's all that we have in terms of humanities. We're in every top 10 in the country. That's in newspapers and consumer guides, that sort of thing. And this is a very, very lively business. There is now a journal in the higher education sector in Britain that is entirely about ranking and league tables. It comes out 4 times a year and it's full. And it's just about how universities deal with league tables. I don't personally think it's the most interesting thing to be looking at, but it's there. And since the last 2 years, we've been #1 on student satisfaction. And I want to tell you a bit about how we got there. We had to look very carefully at who we are, what is specific about Bath, and how can we make that the best it can be. One thing is that we have a 1-year undergraduate placement. So 60% of our students in their 3rd year stop studying for a year and they work. The majority of them get paid for that work, and they work with very large companies for the engineering. There's lots of students going into Rolls-Royce. There are endless business students going into Deloitte & Touche. I don't know whether you have that here. PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, so the big, huge consultancy type companies. It's quite interesting to see how they come back. By the time they come back after a year, they have experienced all that theory in real life. It's only a year, but still, it's quite impressive. And they come back like that. And you can see them in the way, we call it the placement swagger. I have no idea how you translate that, sorry. It's called the placement swagger because there's a swing in their step. They know what they're doing. So they come back with a lot of confidence and a whole set of skills they would not get in any other way. And this is terribly important for their graduation prospects. And we find that our students are highly sought after by the big companies. So about 96% of our students go straight into a graduate job and get a graduate level employment and stay there. We've looked in the longer term, and within 10 years, a very high percentage of our former students are in leading positions in institutions. And that's probably because of that placement year. It's not just the fact that they've had the experience, it's the fact that they come back, and in the final year, we talk about it, it gets reflected on, we discuss it, and we think very hard about what they've learned. The education we offer is an all-round education. There's all the academic work, but there's a lot of work on skills development. There's lots of social, cultural, and sporting life. One of the things that's quite remarkable is our student union influences what we do academically, but there is a huge influence in terms of what they do in societies. We have over 200 societies within the student union who do all sorts of things, from organizing skiing trips to volunteering in town, working with homeless people locally, to teaching in schools, to football organization, the Korean cooking organization, the Harry Potter Club. There's all sorts of things that they do. And this is entirely organized by students. We don't organize this. The university does not get involved. There are a few officers who take care of the administration side of things, but we expect our students to organize these things ourselves. And it's a terribly important way of developing leadership skills. That's something that our students value very highly, so there's no shortage of people who will put themselves forward and run for positions of leadership in those societies. Not entirely sure what running a Harry Potter society really looks like on your CV, but there we are. You've led something. So high levels of self-sufficiency by our students. They are top quality students, and that makes my life easier, a lot easier. In the British system, you take your A-level, so your final diploma from your secondary school. in 3 main areas. Quite often for our students that's 4 or even 5, and we expect an A grade by and large. So when the students come in, they are the top students, and in a way that makes the teaching easier. We do not have retention problems or progression problems. They're very able students. What we particularly have concentrated on is making sure that the student voice is well organized and that we listen to these very capable, hardworking, ambitious students because they're worth listening to. They're a very important part of the education process. It would be mad not to listen to them, especially because they're so qualified. The line that we took was we wanted to achieve excellence through student engagement. Essentially, the way I explain it with my own staff and with the academics in the university is, if you have the student learning experience and the student learning needs and the intellectual ability that the students come from, and you have the teaching alongside, if you can get that as close as possible together so it matches, that's where your quality is. Which means that the students need to understand what we're trying to do in our teaching, what we're trying to do in terms of their learning, and what we're trying to offer to them, how they can get the best out of it. But it also means that our academic community, our staff community, needs to look very hard at who these students are. And what we found was that quite often our academic staff expected the students to be like they were when they were students. Sometimes that's 35 years ago. Things have changed a little. So there was a real discussion about what are students like now. And instead of looking at data and surveys, we've tried to look at it in a broader way. Before I talk about student engagement, if you look into this field, in research terms, people call a lot of things student engagement. And I think we have to be very careful about that. Student engagement quite often relates to individual student learning, motivation, teaching methods. It's what happens in the classroom between the student and the work. That process, that pedagogical process that takes place there. Some interesting work by Solomonides and a number of other people on that area. This is not what I'm talking about. That's the matter between the academic staff and the students to work on. I work at an institutional level. That's not what I'm looking at here. My area is looking at the relation of structures and processes. How do we get the negotiation between staff and student to take place to make the teaching the best it can be? And I'll say a lot more about that. There's also a form of student engagement, and you see that in the American literature quite a lot, which relates to identity. How do you get specific social groups to engage with higher education? How do you get specific groups based on gender or economic background or cultural background to engage with higher education? And how do you change your university to support those students particularly? If you're interested in looking at all those different forms of student engagement, it's worthwhile looking at the work of Vicky Trowler, who did a huge literature review in 2010. And that's a great place to start, so you can skip all those things that you're not interested in and zoom in on the bit that you are. And then finally, there's a lot of work being done about governance, the committee structures and decision-making structures of the university, identity and ethos. I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole field in itself, and it's fascinating, and I find it very interesting, but that's another speech. What did we do? I started at Bath 8 years ago. I spent the first year trying to understand the university. And that was interesting in itself. If it takes me, having been in higher education for 15 years at that point, if it takes me a year to understand how the university works, how does a student work it out? How does a student arrive at the university and find the support that they need? And we needed to think about that. I very much felt that I needed to look at understanding the authentic institutional and student interests and behaviors, not what the government says, not what the policy comes up with, not what probably our Senate writes down in the paperwork, or maybe individuals look at, but what is the broad experience, what is specific about Bath? Both from the student point of view and from the staff point of view. The biggest part of the process has been about seeking alignment, making sure that that student side and that staff side, that comes together, because that's where the quality is. And then finally, very importantly, and I realize that this is a discussion that you will be having in your institutions as well, do we actually recognize and celebrate learning and teaching? If it goes well, what does a teacher get for that? Can they ever get promoted on learning and teaching? Are there awards and prizes? Is there any recognition of that? Or is the only thing that really matters in an institution the research side of things? And in the UK, that's been quite a difficult but interesting discussion. In terms of the first step, we looked for a long time at understanding the institution and the students. So we used lots of surveys, we did lots of observations. I spent a wonderful few months sitting in the back of lecture theatres, talking to students, waiting till the coffee break started, and then sidling up to some students and sort of say, tell me about your experience at Bath, how's it going? Why did you choose Bath? What's going so well? Did it live up to your expectations? What have you come across? And the stories that the student told me have been absolutely marvelous, occasionally a bit shocking, but most of the time really very positive and made my job very enjoyable. Lots of interviews, lots of focus groups to try and distill what it is that we do at Bath. Now, this is research that we did in an informal way at the University of Bath. If you actually look at the United States higher education sector, they do this in a big way, and they do it in a particularly organized way. They have the National Survey of Student Engagement. And this goes out to students every year if a university signs up to that, or every 3 years if a university signs up to that. This is a survey which is the second largest in the US. The biggest is the census, so what is it, every 4 or 5 years, counting how many people there actually are in the US and what they do and what religion they are and all those sorts of things. The second largest is the National Survey for Student Engagement. Those questions are very much, in that survey, are very much about how the student engages with what the institution offers and what kind of experience they have. That has allowed researchers like Pike and Kuhl to look at the type of institutions that there are. And they have terminology to describe specific types of institutions. And it helps you as an institution to think about what the student experience is that you offer. So one of them is homogeneous and interpersonally cohesive. Another one is high-tech, low-touch. And I'll take you through a few of those, because that is actually quite an interesting way of looking at what type of university you are and what kind of student experience you offer. And once you've worked that out, you can concentrate on how you want to take change and development further. This is a picture of Oxford. This is the, no, it's the observatory. I was going to say the Bodleian Library, but it's the observatory. It's traditional. It's very much trusted. It's internationally well known. It's quite elite. Huge excellence. Oxford's the place, if you arrive there, you, in higher education terms, for us at least, internationally, you've achieved. The student experience, if they did the NESI, would come out as homogeneous and interpersonally cohesive. It is very much a bunch, it's bundled. It is very coherent what happens in Oxford. You know the kind of student experience that you go for. There's lots of tutorial, there's lots of individual work together with staff, there's lots of individual work together with other people. It is interpersonally quite cohesive. You're not a number. There will be several people in the institution that know you because they do the personal tutorial work, etc. But it's quite homogeneous. It is a one way of working. That's the way they work. They don't do distance learning. They don't do online stuff. It's a particular kind of way of working. And that's great, it's fine. I mean, let's be honest, Oxford and Cambridge, great places, that works. But it's a very specific student experience. This is the University of Manchester, and I picked the library because that looks rather nice. Innovative, very research-driven, very modern, very ambitious. And the student experience in NESI terms would come out as academically challenging but supportive. It's large. A lecture theatre at Manchester doesn't look like this. Well, they got a few, but most of them, they would be incredibly large. You're looking at 300 to 500 students. It's not very personal. But it has good structures, so if you need the support or if you need the development, it's there. It's a different kind of student experience that gets offered there. I've just been through this with my oldest daughter. She's 18. She wanted to study mathematics, and we went to 12 open days. That took me a little while to get through. But after 12 open days, we got a very different feel of different institutions. She chose not to go to Cambridge, because although the mathematics is brilliant at Cambridge, it was too cohesive. She felt it was claustrophobic. It was too small a world for her to go into. And she felt she wouldn't fit. She went to Warwick, which is this type of institution. It's very modern, it's very academically challenging, but the underlying structure is there. But you're expected to be highly independent. It's a different type of student experience. This is another one again. This is very much based at where students are, and it works with the regional students. So it's not very international. It is not looking at getting students in from everywhere and looking at a very broad student experience. There's a highly personal element in there, but it's also quite a politicized institution. Very different again. This is a new type of institution that is coming through more and more. So this is the kind of thing where you think about, for instance, the Open University or Cranfield University in the UK. Technology-driven, lots of distance learning, very modern, very flexible, very large. It's a different kind of field. This is what the NESI would call high-tech, low-touch. So there's not a lot of interaction with the students. It's very technology-driven, but if you're an independent learner, that will work great for you. So we had to think about who we are. For us, it's important that we are a close community. Our staff have always felt responsible for student success. It's rather embarrassing at the University of Bath if you're known for being a not-so-good teacher. It might not be the case that in the early days you would get promoted on good learning and teaching, but it would at least be embarrassing if you were not good at it, and that says something about the culture. Very research-intensive, strong ethos of peer review, critical pragmatism. We have a lot of lab-based working going on. So being critical about how you work within the university in a practical sense is quite normal. And we argue a lot. We have endless discussions about everything. Where in my last institution, the change process would be planned. This is where we want to end up. This is the project plan we put in place, and this is the way we're going to get there. It works the other way around at Bath. We have discussions about where we want to go, and then slowly it comes to where we want to go. By the time we put the policy in place, it's already started happening. So it's a different kind of approach. But it's quite traditional, and certainly when I started there, it was a lecture, a workshop, a seminar, some lab-based work, and that's it. Very little work online. Getting externals in was quite a new thing, so it was fairly traditional. Our students, I've said a lot about this already, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but what is important is that fourth bullet point. Our students are very interested in networking and building up their CV. The type of students that come to Bath are looking at the next step. They are looking at the world of work and what they want to achieve there. And a lot of our students will make a big effort to make sure that by the time they leave the university, their address book is full of names and numbers of people that they can work with later on. And they do. When we have alumni events, so when previous students come back, what you see is that all of those connections are still there. It's just that they now work together. They're not just friends. There's all sorts of things happening together. We had to debate a lot because that's Bath, that's what we do. We had long debates about who owns the education. Is it, as staff, is it our education that we offer to the students? Or is learning actually the important bit, and that bit is owned by the students? So do we need to change the way we think about what education is? We have taken an approach whereby we've enabled our student union very much to have a voice. Our student union is represented on every committee in the university, except when it is about human resources, so it's staff, the staff side of things, so they're not on promotion groups. There is a very strong involvement in all of the committees, and it goes up right up to the top. So they're on Senate and they're on Council as well. They'll put papers forward, they'll discuss, they'll speak. And they're incredibly well informed. And we've been quite deliberate about that. Hasn't always been easy. It has been known to take a year or 2 years discussion before the academic staff community said this is okay, they can join, but they have by now. All of our teaching enhancement, all of our teaching development happens with students. So to give an example, I have a fund which every year we open up to the academics to make bids to engage in some teaching innovation, and we give them £12,000 or £20,000 to develop something new. You can only get that project funding if half of your project team are students. Because we believe that unless you have the discussion with students early on in terms of what you do in your teaching, it's not going to match. And there is a real risk there, so we take that approach. We also do a lot of peer comparison and a lot of teaching statistics. We have probably too many surveys by now, and everything that moves gets measured in one way or another. So if I need to, I can look exactly how many students engage with the library, how many students have been online and when. I can check, and I have done just last week, looking at our video lecture capture. So a lot of our lecturing happens with a camera in the room. It's actually attached to the ceiling. And it gets recorded, and that gets put online. And the students can use that for revision purposes. Oh, sorry. You get all sorts of nice statistics coming out of that, showing what it is that the students look at, particularly which concepts they understood and which they didn't understand, when they use it. And what we find is they use it 3 weeks before the exam, between 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when the most use takes place. And it's enormous. And that gives you all sorts of information you can then start acting upon. We're actually thinking about switching it off at 12 o'clock at night because we think they really should go to bed at some point, but I don't think we'll do that. Further discussions are things like this kind of thing. And that final question is the most important one. If your students start telling you more and more about your teaching and are involved in all sorts of ways, one of the ways is that near the end of every unit module, students fill in online a survey about how it went. Was the teaching okay? Was the material in order? How did you do? Did you make enough of a contribution yourself? And what was the quality of the teaching by this teacher? And there's a name of the person that taught you. And if 5 people taught you, all 5 of them appear. The information that comes out of that is publicly available. So the next lot of students has to have that information. And the academic member of staff responds to it and sort of says, well, great that you all liked it so much. We'll do more of this or that next year. But if it hasn't gone so well, they also need to respond. That's quite something. And the question is, are students always right? I find this difficult. Some of my best professors, when I was a student, were the ones I hated. They were difficult. They made me work incredibly hard. They made me insecure. It was a struggle. I had to rethink everything I did. 5 years later, I look back on it and think, he was right. You don't want to lose that. So some of this is quite a difficult debate. That debate hasn't ended. And is there a point at which we have to say to students, it's enough? And we do that, actually. We have lots of committee meetings where we say to students, if that's what you want, that's fine. But there is a cost to that, either in time or actually a financial cost. So if we do that, then we can't do this, this, or this. Is that what you want? And then quite often they go back, and there's a further discussion in the student union, and they'll come back and say, actually don't, because we value those things more. So there is a negotiation going on there. And because of the type of students that we have, and because they think as prospective managers, quite a few of them, in a way that works. I can't say it works at all universities, but for us it does. These are some of the enhancements that took place because the students spoke up and we were willing to listen. Lots of increased feedback on assessed work, much more than happened previously. We are now introducing anonymous marking of work. I have no idea whether that's standard in Spain, but for us it makes a real difference. What we are finding, to our embarrassment, is that, looking at other institutions as well, that it's better for women and it's better for black students if we mark anonymously and we have no idea who we're marking. It makes up to 10% difference for women. That is still what we're looking at. So the students were absolutely right when they said, I don't care what it costs, I don't care what you do, but this really needs to do. And they had the research data. They did a presentation to us with all the research data and endless amount of literature and having talked to other universities. It was so impressive. There wasn't anything we could say, but okay, yes, we'll do it. Much more interactive teaching, increased support for the placements. We have a new tutorial system and a lot more blended learning. Again, something that a lot of our academics found quite difficult, but are now engaging with. The result is that students are incredibly proud of being part of Bath, because it's a university that listens. It's their university. They talk about we at Bath. When we talk about the academic community now, we talk about staff and students. That's the case throughout the institution. The academic community is no longer just the academic staff, it's the students as well. Lots of recognition, reward, and stimulating success has gone into it. My office runs a large effort on communicating of teaching developments. Whenever somebody achieves highly in teaching, they get a new project in, there's a research project on teaching, they've introduced a new type of teaching and the reviews are good, we will communicate that to the entire community. It goes on the staff website, it goes on the student website, we have brochures and celebrations, and a few weeks from now we've got a reception coming up with terribly British mince pies and mulled wine. For Christmas, where we celebrate all sorts of learning and teaching. We have prizes, awards, social events, all manner of things. And that was interesting, because when we introduced that about 6 years ago, suddenly all manner of people who did fantastic things on learning and teaching, but very quietly, started coming out of the woodwork. And suddenly they felt recognized, it had status, it mattered. And at the same time, we were going up in the league tables, so that really helped. Our senior management is very serious about this. A few years ago, we did a shadowing project whereby we had academic staff walk in the shoes of a student for a day. So they follow a student for a day, and then the student follows the academic back to learn to understand each other. Our vice-chancellor did that. She followed a student for a day and came back and said, we need to do something about the lunch queues, because waiting for lunch this long before you get some food is a bad thing. She realized that the teaching had changed so much that in a room like this, there's actually lots of conversation going on between the lecturer and the students, rather than the sort of full frontal lecturing, as we call it. It made a real impact in terms of that level. And for staff, it made a real impact because it showed that the senior team cared about learning and teaching. It's now also possible at Bath to get promoted on learning and teaching. We now have 5 professors who got there through the learning and teaching route. That's on the basis of national reputation and international reputation. Not the research of learning and teaching yet, but very much on national influence and international influence. Those are the people quite often that contributed to getting us into the league tables where we are. It does rather change how things work. I'm Director of Learning and Teaching Enhancement. When I started the job, it was my responsibility to come up with what needed to change in teaching. That's gone. I don't come up with what needs to change in teaching anymore. The students do, and the staff do. So as an institution, it takes a little while to get used to losing the initiative. It's not centrally decided anymore. It comes up from the ground. But it does mean it's relevant, and it does mean it lives and it continues. So we've lost the initiative on some things, but actually found out that it worked a lot better. And we do allow the disciplines to be very different. We don't expect physics to be taught the way management is taught. There are huge differences in how departments are run. And then that happened. We became first in the National Student Survey last year. These results always come through when I'm standing in some fields putting up a tent, because they always come through in the middle of the school holidays. So I got the phone call that we were first, and I'm standing there holding up a tent pole with my mobile phone on the side, thinking, what am I supposed to do now? This is fantastic. This shows so much how much our staff and students have managed to make it work. So that was fantastic. My shock was even bigger when it happened again this year, because I really hadn't counted on it. Together with our press office, we'd worked out all sorts of answers if we'd go down a little bit, if we'd go down a lot. How we would communicate this within the university and etc. Because if you're first, you expect to go down. And we didn't. So that was the one press answer we hadn't prepared for. But there you go. Anyway, I've said an awful lot. I thought I'd leave you with some references. I can leave this presentation behind if anybody wants to use them. I don't think you can read it. Can you read it? Probably not. We'll send it round. But I think I want to leave it there and give you, hopefully that's given you a bit of the journey towards where we have come to at Bath. The main thing I hope you take away is that you can only get work done if you use 2 hands. And the one side is the student side, and the other side is the staff side. And unless you move them together, you're not going to get any work done. That's the main thing that we have worked on. Thank you.
Bueno, Gwen, muchísimas gracias. La verdad es que ha sido una conferencia magnífica y yo creo que seguro que hay muchas preguntas al respecto. Yo me he anotado aquí unas cuantas, pero vamos, espero que en la sala haya otras muchas. Así que, si os parece, abrimos un turno de preguntas.
Thank you very much por tu charla, me ha encantado. Yo quería preguntar, para compartir con todos, si nos podías explicar cómo funcionan las Student Union en el Reino Unido, la financiación que tienen desde el Estado y cómo se integran en la vida universitaria, que es un poco para mí lo más novedoso del sistema británico y que en buena parte contribuye a estos resultados. Gracias.
Okay, thank you. That's a crucial question, actually. I didn't go into it because you're talking to student unions this afternoon, and I didn't want to steal their thunder. What we've done at Bath, and this happens in a lot of universities, we have invested as an institution in our students' union to make sure they have a strong infrastructure. So there is a chief executive who oversees all of it. They have some commercial outlets, so they've got a shop and that sort of thing, and that brings in money for them as well. They've got a nightclub. This makes a lot of money, especially if you have all the students living on campus. Then we fund them to have some coordination for an academic representation system, as we call it. What happens is at the beginning of every academic year, students are being asked to put themselves forward as representatives. And there's then an election, and the election bit is crucial. Because if the students are chosen to represent students by the department, they're not credible. Because the department could choose the nice ones, and the ones that are on their side. They will never choose the difficult one. And some departments really need the difficult one. So we expect elections. Now, the elections are run by the student union. We fund them to run that. So there's actually 2 coordinators because it's quite big now. That means that for our undergraduate provision, we have about 400 student representatives. So that means that for big programs, there's 1. If you have 2 or 3 small programs that are co-taught, then you have 1 for that. So it's quite an intricate system. We make sure that the students know who the academic representatives are, and the academic representatives get trained. So last Saturday, I was in the university because the rep training took place. That's a conference for a day, and they get educated on all sorts of things. And one of the things that's terribly important is to understand how the committee structure works, how you deal with committees, how you make sure that if the committee doesn't want to listen to you, it will listen to you, how to write committee papers, that sort of thing. Because there is a skill to making yourself heard. So we do all of that before they get onto the committees. The student union itself does all sorts of other things. So a couple of times a year, they have academic council. And what happens on those days is that because there's too many academic reps now and there's timetabling issues and whatever, they run 2 academic councils, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, where all the academic reps come together, and they talk about specific topics. That then relates to that the student reps then get asked, what do you make of this? What's the direction that we should be taking? What should we be advising the institution in terms of what we do? Now, the student reps know that that's coming, and they've talked in their own departments and in their own programs already, so they've got the student voice already there. So they're incredibly well informed. At Academic Council, quite often I have to turn up as well, and they ask me questions about the project I promised last year that we would deliver on. So on anonymous marking, a few weeks from now, I have to go to Academic Council and tell the student reps how we're doing and what the progress is being made and what isn't working yet. So it's quite a process. It sounds scarier than it is actually, because actually I love Academic Council. It's a really, it makes me realize what actually happens, because on paper it all works, but the students can tell me whether it actually works. That's good. What we also have is within the departments, we have what we call staff-student liaison committees. And the staff-student liaison committees meet 5 times a year. All the academic reps come there, and a small number of staff. And that's the point at which the academic reps can say, I have informally raised several times now that we don't get our deadlines for work soon enough, or the reading list isn't done, and nothing has been done about it. It really, how are we going to engage with this? It also means that staff can come back to the students and sort of say, these are the things that we have done. You said you really wanted it, but actually none of the students is taking the opportunity up. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to tell your fellow students that either you take it up or, for instance, more seminars is a question that comes up quite often. So you organize seminars between 4 and 5 in the afternoon and the students don't turn up. It's a bit pointless. So, you know, that kind of discussion takes place. So some of it is about structure. In terms, going back to the student union, they have a building. And of course, the university pays for that building. The student union is a separate charity with its own trustees, so they are not answerable to us other than for those things that we pay for. So the representation system, those kind of things. I guess that's broadly it. Oh, no it isn't. Terribly important, the president of the student union meets with our vice-chancellor every other week. Now, be careful what I say here. Our vice-chancellor is a very powerful woman. She is very highly regarded nationally, and she's very influential. She's also quite strong in her views, so getting her to say yes to things can be quite difficult. But oddly enough, where we as staff and as senior staff know that that can be quite difficult, the student union gets a good hearing. So when the student union goes and they say, we've talked to the students, we've had a survey, it's been discussed in all the different places, why aren't you doing it? They usually come out and she does it. So there is a real negotiation going on there, which works quite well. Now, we know better than to ask either the vice-chancellor or the president of the student union exactly how that works, because, you know, that's, that's their business. But we have a different president of the student union every year or every 2 years, and it does continue to work like that. It does show a real commitment at the senior level to learning and teaching and to getting it right for students. So I think that's important as well. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Well, thank you for your excellent presentation. You were talking about student engagement, but I wonder, probably because we belong to a very different model, but I wonder how you work with the teaching engagement. I mean, you were talking about the two sides of the problem, how to align them, but what is the answer of the teaching staff when you talk them about working for what students ask and working for, or changing the methodology to align with the students' interests? How do they respond to this? What's the answer? How do you work with the teachers to obtain this success?
The first thing I should say is it's not easy. It really isn't easy. And many of you, will have spent a big part of their career having discussions with people who don't want to change. Because that's what our life is like, isn't it? So it's a slow process. I've tried to address it from different directions. One of the things that's terribly important is that you work at an institutional level on what the status of learning and teaching is. When I started 8.5 years ago, learning and teaching was important. You needed to get it right, but we didn't have the statistics to look whether we could see whether it was right. And it would never get you to the professorial level, because only research did, and big grants did, and that sort of thing. And the discussions about learning and teaching were very pragmatic. So we talked about, if we have more students, we need more lecture theatres. We didn't talk about what we do in those lecture theatres. So it was very pragmatic. A big effort was about first getting the senior managers on board to look at what learning and teaching could be and why it mattered. We've had a bit of luck there. When I arrived, the reason I was appointed at Bath was because there was a lot of money going, government money going into learning and teaching, but you had to bid for it. You didn't get it automatically. You had to put a bid in. And Bath put several bids in and didn't get it, because they weren't seen as a place where learning and teaching was distinctive, different, excellent. So they set up this unit. Started out with 11 people, there's 80-something now. We started out with 11 people to make learning and teaching better. And that's what I was told, make it better, give us a reputation, and make the quality inspection go away. Well, I've done the first two, I'm not doing the last one, because I actually believe in that. But there was an interest within the institution, and that helped change the way we could address it. With academic staff, some staff really like this. Some staff really enjoy the teaching and want to get the enthusiasm across. And if you can work with that, you're going to get there. That's fine. Some staff find it very threatening to have all these students. I mean, just look at it. If I'm the lecturer and you're the students, there are rather a lot of you. And most of you are sitting higher than I am. We think that as the professor or as a lecturer, we have the power, but that's not how a lot of academics feel. Quite a few academics feel that they are completely outnumbered by these students. It is quite intimidating, especially if they've never had any teacher training. It's quite a scary thing to do. And unless in the first few years you build up that confidence in teaching, you're not going to get the confidence to change. So that was something that we really needed to think hard about. And that's why recognition of good teaching was so important. It makes people confident, and it makes people willing to take risks and try something innovative. So that's been a big part of it. I have to say there's some staff and there's some bits of the university that haven't changed and that won't change in the time that I'm there, unless they retire before I do. There is that. There are a few bits that aren't going to change, but by and large, once you slowly get that change in ethos, it does move. It helps if your senior managers are on board. Much as I hate to admit it, the National Student Survey really helped. It made staff accountable. It was the first time that the students could publicly say, it's good, it's really good, or not. And that made people across a whole department think, before the next survey comes in, what do they think of us? And they wanted to know before the national result came in. So the National Student Survey, there's all sorts of issues with it in terms of consumerism and whatever, but the National Student Survey made institutions and academics accountable for their teaching. And that's been a huge driver in all of it. So some of it is environment and national politics. Some of it is about really trying to understand where these people come from and what it is that they need. As a manager, I can't go to an academic and sort of say, from now on, you will teach like this and you will teach like that, because they're not going to do it. There's nothing I can do about that. But if I can convince some of the academic staff to see what other academic staff are doing and to take into account what the students say, then it turns around. What we found is that the biggest internal important step is to organize a student union. That's why it's such a good question. Once the students spoke up, once the students were clear, and once the students were looking for changes, a lot of the academics and a lot of the departments started coming to us and sort of say, so how do we do that? Can you help us with that? And that's a real change in the kind of relationship. So they came to the quality people and sort of said, what do other departments do? And what should we be doing about this? So you need to look at reward and recognition. You need to make sure that you have a really strong student voice. You need to look at your systems to make sure that the support is there. I couldn't have done this with the small team I had at the time. We do have academic staff who come to us and say, my students really don't rate my teaching. If I'm completely honest, I hate teaching because I don't know what I'm doing and I feel really insecure about it. And can you help? And we have staff that will deal with them individually and sit in the back of their lecture, tell them what they're doing great, introduce them some different ways of teaching, help them with techniques, and introduce them to other staff who teach in the same way and are perfectly fine with it. Makes a real difference. So you do need the structures behind it. So it's quite it's a book, you know. The answer to that one is a book, really. And to be fair, it went faster than I thought it would. I thought it would take longer. And the biggest reason for it going as fast as it did was the National Student Survey, the introduction of the fees and national changes. It's not a full answer. And it depends on which institution you're in, what you can work with. Yeah. Okay.
Buenos días y muchas gracias por la intervención, que ha sido muy interesante. Y felicidades por ese primer puesto alcanzado, que claro, tiene la dificultad efectivamente que solo puedes empeorar, ¿no? O mantenerte allí. Yo le hablo desde la perspectiva de agencia de calidad En Aragón, en la región de Aragón, hay una agencia de aseguramiento de la calidad externa y veo, salta a la vista, lo veo en las referencias bibliográficas que estamos viendo, que usted ha colaborado recientemente con la QAA, con la Agencia Británica de Calidad, en temas de participación de los estudiantes. ¿Podría darnos un poco más de información? ¿Cuál es su valoración sobre la participación de los estudiantes de la Universidad de Bath en evaluaciones y en temas de garantía externa de la calidad? ¿Les gusta colaborar? ¿Colaboran activamente? ¿La Universidad de Bath les proporciona formación como evaluadores o colaboradores en materia de aseguramiento de la calidad? Gracias.
There's a bit of a mixed answer to that. When it comes to our academic representatives, we do train them on quality. They are part of our quality structure, very much so. So when there is evaluation of teaching, they're very much part of that, and they need to have the quality background, because it is difficult. Our quality assurance in the UK is very much about process. It's not about output, so it's about whether you've got the processes in place and whether you've got the systems in place to pick up on things that need to be improved. That's essentially how it works. So it doesn't look at the results. There's no observations in the classroom or anything like that. So for the student representatives, yes, they do. So when we have once every 5 years, you need to look at the program again, and you need to say, yes, this is the right academic standards, and this is the right quality, and the students are part of that panel. Now, we never ask students to make a judgment on the academic standards, because you have to graduate first, really, don't you? But we do ask them about the quality, and they are part of that. When we have the sort of major inspection, which we have every 5 or 6 years, the students put their own submission in. So as an institution, we send stacks of information and an evaluation document of about 60 pages. So does the student union. They do that separately. So we train them and we support them on that. When it comes to our students, we don't, the rest of the students, and we're quite deliberate about that, because we just want them to be students. If the quality assurance mechanism were to require our students to understand how the quality assurance mechanism works, then I don't think the quality assurance mechanism is working. The quality assurance mechanism needs to look at what the students experience. In 2012, we were at a point in the higher education sector in Britain where we needed to codify what that student voice should be, how students should be heard. So there is a policy document now, which is part of the Code of Practice, codified from the Quality Assurance Agency, which sets out what's expected in terms of student engagement. And I had good fortune of being part of that. That is slightly problematic, because what happened at that point is, I mean, I had very mixed feelings about whether to do that or not. Partly because you then start prescribing how things should work in an institution. And as you can see from my presentation, I believe very much that institutions need to do their own thing. Your autonomous academic institutions, if you have a different kind of student experience. If you're a distance learning institution, what does academic reps, being an academic rep, mean? Because you don't meet the other students in your distance learning context. So it just doesn't work. So where we are now is that we have a structural approach that is being expected from institutions from a policy level, and our student union very much needs to be part of that. But we, like most other institutions, try to keep the rest of our students out of it. Now, they feed into the quality assurance because they do unit evaluations, they do program evaluations, they can feed all sorts of things in through the student union or through their academic reps. There's all sorts of separate surveys that we do. We quite often stop them on campus, just a random bunch of students, and say, we're about learning and teaching at the university. Can you tell us more about what you think about this, that, or the other? Some engage, some don't engage. But we don't want to put that into a quality context with processes and procedures, because that's not part of the student experience. That's our experience. So that's quite a difficult question to answer. Where they are very influential these days is through the unit evaluations, because it makes a huge difference once you start asking your students what they make of your teaching. Yeah. At the moment, if you want to get promoted from lecturer to senior lecturer, even if you go the research route, so you do that strictly on the basis of your research, and you got your £4 million grant in, and you know, all that sort of stuff, you cannot get there unless your teaching scores are good. So on a score of 1 to 5, you have to have 3.5 or more, because otherwise you won't get promoted. See, and that gives real power to students that they are not aware of. Students don't realize that when they fill out those unit evaluations, and staff are not allowed to say it, so, you know, when they fill out those unit evaluations, they don't realize that they are actually affecting somebody's career. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Gwen, for your great presentation. I'd like to ask a bit like the Vice Rector about change, but from an institutional point of view, because I suppose your institution was not like this 10, 15, or whatever years ago. So what makes the change? What's the key point for making student engagement an institutional priority? It's the National Student Survey, it's the idea of funding following the students. What's the key point for this, in your opinion?
There's never one reason why an institution changes, unless it's really failing. I mean, if you're at the brink of disaster, then you're going to have to change, and the fact that you were at the brink of disaster was the reason that you changed. There are multiple facets in there. I think as an institution, we're quite good at understanding what's happening at national policy, and we make a big investment. That's why I'm on all these national kind of things, to basically find out what's up next. So we could see the change in the higher education sector coming. And Bath, of course, the realization was before I was there, so I can't quite say that. I think the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Learning and Teaching, Professor Ian Jameson, and the Vice-Chancellor, Glynis Breakwell, realized that they were missing the boat. That on learning and teaching nationally, in the NSS, in terms of funding, in terms of reputation, and that's about the time when the ranking started in the newspapers, we were doing a mediocre job. So out of the 120 institutions when I started, we were 62, 48, that sort of level, which means grey, magnolia, nothing, beige. You don't stand out. The NSS has been important. I think the biggest thing was when we realized that the Funding Council might take the cap off the student numbers. What that means is we've always had a situation whereby the government says, this year you are taking 14,839 students, and if you get 5 more, we punish you financially. If you get 5 too few, we punish you financially. It's slightly more than that, but it really is having getting a jumbo jet to land on a postage stamp, that kind of thing. But it was very clear, and that's our student number cap. And what became clear is that more and more of the political parties were talking about introducing competition. And in order to compete, you need to take the student number cap off. And those discussions started taking place, and most of the political parties said, that's what we need to do. We need to get these institutions to compete, because that will make them change. And it did. I think for our senior management, it was that realization that if you are beige in the middle, and the student number cap comes off, and students can choose to go where they like, and we can become bigger or smaller. And our funding follows students. So if we have more students, we get more money. If we have fewer students, we get less money. We still have the same staff bill and energy bill and all of that. I think that must have been the realization underneath that. Either we were ready for that change, or you're 5 years late. And if you're 5 years late, you're still beige. You can't move out of that middle. And our Vice-Chancellor is very ambitious. I think she spotted that. That was a big. But national policy made a huge change. If I had to do what I've done over the last 8, 9 years, in a country where you didn't have that national policy, it's still difficult. But across Europe, this is happening. I can't judge on Spain, I really don't. As you understand, I don't speak Spanish, I certainly can't read a Spanish newspaper. But across Europe, this is happening. I mean, the Netherlands have introduced something similar, and in Germany, they are looking at down this route. The Scandinavian countries, funding follows students. So it's a mechanism that European countries are increasingly using to get more out of their public sector universities. I think ultimately that was the biggest one.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Sobre todo, gracias. Estabais comentando desde el punto de vista del profesorado, docencia y demás. Me gustaría preguntar sobre los estudiantes. ¿Cuánto tiempo tardaron en asimilar lo que era el proceso y las nuevas obligaciones que les estabais dando? O sea, entiendo los poderes y estoy encantado con eso, pero ¿cuánto tiempo los estudiantes tardaron en entender la situación? En periodo de años más o menos. ¿Se adaptaron rápidamente o se encuentran en la misma situación que los docentes que has comentado? O sea, me refiero, un pequeño grupo de gente que no quiere adaptarse a lo nuevo.
Right. In terms of wanting to change, 3 minutes. The students had views. You don't have a student body without views. I mean, we train them to be intellectuals and we train them to be critical. They had views. But your question is more than that. Your question is about how, what were the obstacles that we had in terms of students, in terms of willingness to change. We see different things. Once somebody becomes an academic rep, a student rep, they're clearly willing. That's not your difficult bunch. This is partly the reason why I gave you the answer that I did. We don't bother a lot of our students with change and educational development and quality assurance and whatever. Most of them don't know what that means. And that's fine, because actually they want to be an engineer, and that's great. They don't need to engage with that. But there were specific groups which were harder to reach. We certainly have that. Our student body, and I'm going to refer to some of the national research I did now, I'm going to move away from Bath. When you are an institution that has lots of mature students who also have care responsibilities, or they've got a job on the side, or they've got an elderly parent to take care of, or, you know, things like that, they are very difficult to engage in this process. They're willing to send you a letter to say, I wish the following things would change because it really doesn't work for me. They're not willing to come to committee meetings because they've got care responsibilities or a job or, you know, whatever. So that's a very different group, and institutions have had to think really hard about how they work with those students. International students are different. We have, I don't know how it works here, we have a lot of Chinese students. And with, not all, depends on where they come from in China, but a lot of our Chinese students are very deferential. They will not speak up. And they certainly won't unionize, because being part of a union, if you're from Malaysia or China, you don't want to be part of a union because that gets you into all sorts of trouble. So that's a really difficult one. And institutions have had to come up with different solutions of working with Chinese students. Quite often the key is having a Chinese member of staff and making inroads in that way. But it's far more informal, and it won't be unionized in the same way. There are specific groups of students where we have difficulty to engage with that kind of change. We have a lot of students from Southeast Asia coming into the system, and we have, in my own institution, rather a lot of students who come through private education. So they've been to the British boarding school, you know the concept. That comes with a particular style and expectation of teaching. To then come into a university, which is, I mean, it's Bath, it's Jane Austen, it's Pride and Prejudice and all that, sounds deeply British, you know. And we do make a big song and dance of being very, very British. To then come into a situation where it's not like a boarding school, and you are not passive, you are expected to comment on all sorts of things and to engage and to help form your education, and you have to be part of the discussion about how assessment is done or how feedback is given is a challenge. And, but that's a challenge we meet with every cohort that comes in new. We had some interesting debates in the institution in the sense that people said, well, if they just want a very British education and they want to take that passive route, why don't we just let them do that? And the line we came out with, not in all departments, but in the majority of our departments came with, at Bath at least, is that actually, if you're a graduate from a university, you're expected to think critically, to ask questions, to look for the better options, to engage with enhancement. That's what you're looking at. You're not a passive. Being an intellectual can't be a passive thing. It's not. There is an engagement there. So maybe if that's hard, then that's part of the learning curve. So that's broadly the line we've taken. It's a very interesting question because I know for myself, I'm a doctoral student. I didn't get a chance to do my PhD when I was a lot younger. So I'm doing it now. And that means that I've been to residential courses where there's quite a number of us from 22 different nationalities. Everybody is a higher education manager. We all have busy jobs. We all have kids and family and whatever. And every year we get asked, could one of you please be a student representative? And we all go, because you can't. So I do understand where that comes from with students. So it's a mixed story.
Sí, yo quiero ser un poco idealista con mi pregunta, pero si quiero ser un poco idealista con mi pregunta, Gwen, todo este movimiento del student engagement, me parece entender que está basado en estas encuestas y en el hecho de que hayan subido tanto las cuotas de matrícula en las universidades, ¿no?, en vuestros países, pero debe tener antes otro fundamento también pedagógico o basado en la investigación educativa. ¿Hay algo ahí también en lo que se ha basado todo este movimiento?
Okay. If I understand your question correctly, you've seen, I've described a number of national developments and the National Student Survey. What was the reason behind it? That's what you're looking for. Well, there's two things. In Britain, we have a huge financial deficit. So there's been, for the last 12, 15 years, discussion about how to bring the financial deficit down. So there's been lots of discussion about how can you make the public sector more financially effective. And one of the ways of doing that is introducing student fees, because you no longer pay for a big part of the higher education bill. The students pay for that. So it's a loan, at which point it's not just money that you pay out, so it's no longer a deficit. You've just created an asset. So it's there's a real economic advantage for governments to do that. So that was kind of on the cards. But what happened at the same time is we've had, you remember I said earlier that we moved the polytechnics and the universities together. That's now one sector. Where that came from is that in Britain there is an awareness that we still very much have a class system, and that's something that needed to change. So in the 1960s, a lot of universities like Bath were built. It's about 24, 28 new universities were just built so that more people could get educated, not just the upper classes. That moved on into the 80s, where we had massification. So we moved from groups of 40 or 60 students to larger groups of, my business school, it's 350 at the moment. Our math is 320. So it looks to much larger student groups. The problem with that is it makes it more expensive, because if you have more people going to university, then the cost to the government is much larger. That was a big driver behind it. The good thing about the higher education system in the UK is we are autonomous institutions. We are, in the legal sense, private institutions. We get funding in from the government, but other than withholding funding or giving us more funding, the government can't tell us what to do. So we have a higher education sector which is quite strong and which unites. So in the face of that kind of economic change, massification, more universities, more students, the finance issues that were coming at us, the lack of capital funding for buildings and whatever that came up, we had, as a sector, the ability to give an answer back. And the answer that we gave back is, that's all nice and fine, but we are academic institutions. What we do is about transformation. Research is a form of transformation, in a way. It's about developing new knowledge. It's about moving society on, or moving science on, or technology on. Learning and teaching is transformational, and that's what we want to keep. And the sector has been very consistent about that. So a lot of effort has gone into educational development and research development in one way or another. So we've had, some of you I know have come across CEDA, which is the Staff and Educational Development Association in the UK. Has been around for about 25 years, 26 years, something like that. So there's always been that strong learning and teaching appetite. It might not have had the best environment for it, it does now, but there's always been that strong appetite. So in terms of the negotiation between the sector and the government, has been the driver on it has to remain transformational. You can't turn us into a product the way it's done in the US. And I think that that's where that driver comes from. But interestingly, when the National Student Survey was developed 11 years ago, or 12 years ago, they didn't have any students on it. So the people who developed it did not talk to students about it. There was no student consultation on it initially. And if you read that now, in Britain, you sort of go, unbelievable, that is just inconceivable now. But that care for getting it right for students has always been a very British higher education thing. And because we are an autonomous sector, in the end, we could collectively say, well, government, that's maybe what you want, but we won't. So we have a negotiation position. And that's kept the academic interest in. I think that that's where that comes from. Although I have to admit I wasn't party to that discussion at the time, because I'd only just arrived in the UK then. Okay.
¿Hay alguna pregunta? Porque ya estamos casi al final. Sí.
Student question.
It's more a bit of a comment, but also a question to you, and touching very much upon what Araceli said. Basically, I think we could very much attach to you what you said. We have about the same situation, being a business school, evaluated constantly in the rankings and so on. But what we have a system that works pretty well, as you have established now. So we work together with the student union. We are quite up in the rankings. Teaching quality is okay. It's probably not brilliant, but it's okay. And so what Araceli said, we have kind of the problem to gain momentum for fundamental educational change. So we have established a kind of comfort zone for everybody, for the students, for the teaching staff, for the management. And I think that's what you actually mentioned a bit, like, is there any spirit, any education, any Bildung idea behind that? And that's something that makes it a bit hard if you come from this very managerial and effectiveness-oriented approach. And that was a question to me. How do you actually keep that spirit for change, that, as you said, the academic interest for change, for doing something fundamentally new, not just optimizing?
I think that's a really, really good question. In my national work, I work with a number of institutions. And what you see is if you take that corporate approach, whereby you sort of say, so now we're going to do this, now we're going to do that, and it's managerial, and it's decided between staff, students, and the management together, this is the direction that it goes. What happens is two things. You get a uniformity across the institution, and you're on a race that you can't win, because the student expectations are this, so you meet it, and then the student expectations are that, so you meet it, and the student expectations are that, and that's when you run out of money, or willingness of your staff, or the size of your campus, or whatever it is, but you're going to run out of resource in one point or another, and at that point, you start doing this. And that's the bit you can't afford, so that kills you. What we've tried to do, and some other universities are increasingly looking at, is to realize that that whole process of negotiation and looking at where what the direction is that you go, is actually not a matter for managers. It's not a corporate decision. This is actually an agenda which is very enabling for staff, because what it goes back to is what you do in management may be great for management, but it won't be for the mathematicians. Mathematicians want something completely, mathematicians are a story in themselves, actually, in our case, but they will want something completely different, and physics wants something completely different. So what happens is you go back to education, the way it works for staff and students in the discipline. So we are becoming more and more discipline specific. There's a really strong culture in physics, which is very different from mechanical engineering. And chemical engineering is different again. They work a lot together with mechanical engineering and with physics and with chemistry, but they have a very particular culture. So it moves the ownership of what happens in learning and teaching back to the discipline and away from the management level. And that's that's difficult. I have discussions with the National Union of Students, which is the sort of national body above all the students' unions in the country in Britain, about whether the model that we use isn't actually getting students to buy into the establishment. You see where I'm coming from. I get accused of being a neoliberal and, you know, all that. It's good fun discussion, but, you know, not very practical. And to some extent, they're right. Because if we have a lot to win by working together collectively, you may run the risk that you don't have a very critical voice somewhere in the system anymore. And that allows space for the national government to be the critical voice, and that's usually not such a good thing. So there is some element there about what you do there. You need to keep that critical side of things. And that creates a new role for educational developers. Because, for instance, in my institution at the moment, my team and I are really firing up, together with a number of academics, a discussion about equality. And about equality for gender, for black students, for international students, for non-traditional students, etc. And looking at, okay, so we're all delighted and we're hyper-satisfied and we're number one and it's all great. Let's have a look at the black students and see how they do. And then you find that actually the story is different. Actually, black students is not fair because we don't have many black students, but you look at gender, specifically in engineering, and there are things to be looking at. So as an educational developer, you come back to that critical role whereby you every now and then have to say, okay, we're all happy, we're all fine on those things, but if you take a different lens, you look at it differently, there are different things you need to look at. But the agenda, because it's more negotiated at the discipline level, is harder to oversee. That's definitely the case.
Bueno, pues yo creo que ya estamos en hora. Simplemente, bueno, agradecer mucho todo lo que no solo la charla, sino las respuestas a las preguntas que habéis realizado. Y por concluir, aunque tenía alguna pregunta, pero con la hora que yo creo que la dejamos, simplemente a mí me gustaría recalcar, porque hay vicerrectores de estudiantes, hay miembros de agencias de calidad, algunas de las personas que estamos aquí estamos bastante obsesionados con el tema de la docencia, ¿no? Y entonces, claro, Gwen ha dicho un par de cosas que es muy interesante. No se puede promocionar si no se es buen docente. Y eso, joder, tú dices, joder, pues parece bastante lógico, ¿no? Bueno, ha dicho, se graban las clases de los profesores. Si le estoy pasando una encuesta a los profesores de la Universidad de Sevilla y estoy a punto de salir ardiendo directamente porque dicen que los estudiantes realmente, bueno, la opinión que tienen va en función del número de aprobados y que, bueno, cosas raras de este tipo, y que no, que la opinión de los estudiantes, porque no, que eso no puede condicionar. Entonces, claro, por no entrar en el debate, y yo luego en la comida y en el café hablaremos de esto, la pregunta que me hacía es, ¿cómo consigo yo grabar las clases de los profesores de la Universidad de Sevilla? Que es fantástico, eso es fantástico. Porque además cuando uno se ve en una grabación, y yo lo hice en un curso de formación, uno dice, uy, qué tontería hago yo, Dios mío. Es decir, eso es lo que hago yo. Y entonces es muy interesante verse a uno mismo impartiendo una clase, desde el punto de vista, insisto, de aprendizaje propio. Y por tanto, lo que a uno le sorprende es que esas personas no quieran hacer esa evolución, ¿no? Y a lo mejor tendríamos que preguntarnos qué hacen esas personas dentro de la institución. Pero bueno, ahí ya lo dejo, porque si no, entonces si me caliento, entonces ya terminamos mal. Lo dicho, muchas gracias a Gwen, a todos por las preguntas, y esperemos que siga en este nivel la jornada. Muchas gracias.